Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really fast-moving area in human reproduction, polygenic embryo selection, specifically in IVF. It offers this, new level of choice based on genetics, but it also brings up some pretty deep fears, things like eugenics, inequality. It's complicated.
Absolutely. And our mission here is to really look at the source material. We've got research, policy papers, info from companies like Herasite. We want to separate what's technically possible, the reality, from maybe some of the public anxiety around it.
Yeah.
And I think we need to hit one thing straight away.
Yeah.
The biggest misconception.
Okay. What's that?
This is selection. It's choosing from what's naturally there. It is absolutely not gene editing. We're not like tinkering with the DNA code itself.
Right. That's a critical distinction. People hear genetics and immediately think CRISPR, changing genes. But this is different.
Totally different. It's just about getting more information.
Yeah.
Think about it. If you're doing IVF now, you can already test embryos. There's PGTM for single gene things like Tay-Sachs, and PGTA for chromosome issues like Down syndrome. This new step, polygenic selection, it's basically just extending that same idea, extending the testing to cover conditions influenced by, well, hundreds or thousands of genes. Polygenic traits.
And it's important to remember, selection isn't actually new in IVF, is it? I mean, the sources point out doctors already select embryos.
They do. Currently, it's often based on eyeballing them, right?
Right.
Looking at the morphology, the shape, how they look under a microscope.
That's how they look.
Exactly. And the thing is, how an embryo looks has pretty limited correlation with whether it'll implant successfully or be healthy. It's subjective, is what we've had. But when a doctor picks one embryo out of, say, 10, well, that is selection.
Yeah.
This new technology, it just gives much clearer quantitative data, way less ambiguous information to help make that choice that's already happening.
So let's get into the tech leap here, because we're not talking one gene, like for Tay-Sachs. We're talking traits affected by potentially thousands of genetic variants. Things the sources call highly polygenic: height, diabetes risk, even intelligence.
Right. And the really big breakthrough isn't just calculating a risk score from all those variants. It's how they get the data to do it affordably. See, sequencing a whole embryo genome used to be incredibly expensive, just not practical for routine IVF.
Okay, so what changed?
The innovation is using data that's often already being collected anyway. The standard PGTA test for Down syndrome, it only gives a very sparse snapshot of the embryo's genome.
Just a few data points, really.
Yeah, the tiny fraction. But here's the clever part. If you also have the full genome sequence of both parents,
Which is getting cheaper to do.
much cheaper, then that sparse embryo data acts like a key. An algorithm can use the parents' full genomes as reference blueprints. It compares the embryo's sparse data to the parents' data and essentially statistically fills in the blanks. It imputes the missing 95% or more. So you basically reconstruct the embryo's entire genome virtually.
Wow. Okay, so that reconstruction, that's the trick. It turns a basic chromosome screen into this potential full-blown genetic risk assessment for loads of traits.
Exactly. And this changes the whole information flow. Suddenly, it's not just the clinic deciding what gets tested.
It bypasses the gatekeepers, in a way.
Precisely. A patient could potentially get the raw data from their standard PGTA test, get themselves and their partner sequenced, and then, using third-party services or software, they could generate risk scores for schizophrenia, intelligence, height, whatever, for all their embryos. Even if the clinic only ran the Down syndrome test, the information is kind of democratized. It's out there.
And that flood of information runs right into this major cultural discomfort, especially in the West: intelligence. The numbers are pretty stark, aren't they? Sources say maybe 70–75% of Americans are okay with screening embryos for serious diseases.
Yeah, broad support there.
But ask about screening for intelligence. That number drops like a rock, down to around 40%. Big gap.
It is a big gap. And it's not universal. Look at Singapore, other parts of Asia maybe. There, the support for screening against disease and screening related to psychiatric traits, including things linked to intelligence or academic ability, it's much more aligned, almost equal support. They don't seem to have that same taboo.
So why? Why are we, particularly in the West, so squeamish about genetics when it comes to the brain, to the mind?
Well, it's complex. A lot of it likely traces back to post-World War II history. The reaction against, the horrors of state-sponsored eugenics. We developed these sort of cultural antibodies against genetic explanations for anything touching the mind or behavior.
There's a line drawn.
Yeah. We tend to see physical illness, diabetes, Crohn's disease as, bad luck. Unfortunate. But traits linked to the mind, intelligence, personality, these often get tangled up with ideas about a person's worth, their moral character, their very identity. their self.
It feels different, like you're meddling with the soul, maybe.
Something like that. It feels more fundamental, more invasive to people than intervening against a purely physical condition.
Which, of course, immediately brings up the slippery slope argument. Okay, we select against Tay-Sachs today, but if we start selecting for higher intelligence or against lower intelligence, aren't we inevitably sliding towards, state-controlled eugenics?
That's the fear. And it's where the source materials really stress an important difference. It's the distinction between coercive eugenics and what's sometimes called liberal eugenics.
Okay, break that down.
Coercive eugenics is top-down. Government mandates, forced sterilizations, state control. That violates autonomy, basic human rights. It's what happened historically. Liberal eugenics, on the other hand, isn't a state program. It's just the potential end result of millions of free individual choices made by parents. Parents using technology to try and give their kids what they see as the best start in life. The focus there is on autonomy, on choice.
I see the distinction, but doesn't that individual choice run straight into the inequality problem? If only wealthy people can afford IVF, plus the extra cost of this advanced screening, aren't we just creating a genetic divide? Rich kids get screened for advantages, poor kids don't. It's not state coercion, but maybe it's market coercion leading to a biological class system.
That's the huge policy challenge. It's a real trade-off. If you think that kind of inequality is a major problem, what's the logical fix?
Well, you'd make it accessible, subsidize it maybe. Insurance coverage, government funding.
Right. Increase access to level the playing field.
Mhm.
But then you hit the other side of the autonomy coin. If you use public funds, tax money, or force insurers to cover it, you're making people pay for something they might deeply object to.
Like people with religious objections to IVF itself, or the idea of selecting embryos at all.
Exactly. For someone who believes creating and potentially discarding embryos is morally wrong, being forced to fund it through their taxes or premiums violates their moral autonomy. The sources bring up analogies here. Society already deals with this tension. Think about mandatory vaccinations versus religious exemptions, or the legal respect given to Jehovah's Witnesses refusing blood transfusions, even when doctors think it's necessary. There's always a balance between public good, individual choice, and moral conscience.
So trying to solve the inequality gap with public money pushes the government right back into these very personal reproductive choices.
It does, and that tangle of choice, consequence, and morality leads us to a really fascinating and kind of mind-bending ethical concept,
Yeah.
the non-identity problem.
Okay, let's slow down here. The non-identity problem. What is it, and why does it matter for parents making these choices?
Right, it's a bit counterintuitive. Basically, it says that if you choose embryo B with low risk for condition X, instead of embryo A with high risk for condition X, you haven't actually made the child from embryo A better off. Because the child from embryo A never exists in that scenario. You've chosen to bring a different person, person B, into existence instead of person A. Since person A never existed, they technically weren't harmed by your choice not to select them. They had no grounds to complain, because the alternative for them wasn't a better life, it was no life at all.
Huh. Okay, that does mess with your head a bit. So how does that relate to parental guilt or feeling responsible?
It makes it really complicated. It suggests the choice isn't about harming a specific potential child, but about which potential child to bring into the world. The sources use a powerful analogy, the polio vaccine. Imagine you have, say, 3 kids. For the first 2, the vaccine wasn't available and maybe one got polio. When the third child comes along, the vaccine is available. Would you deny the vaccine to your third child just to be fair to the first 2 who didn't have the chance?
No, of course not. That sounds monstrous.
Exactly. It would seem like a moral failure to deliberately not prevent suffering in the third child, just because you feel bad or guilty about the past. The non-identity problem kind of reframes the decision. It's less about fixing a child, more about choosing which child and the potential life that comes with them.
Scott Alexander's example about the drinker really drives this home too, doesn't it?
Yes, the example of a woman who drinks heavily, learns she's pregnant, and is told stopping drinking now won't prevent fetal alcohol syndrome. But if she stops drinking for 3 months before getting pregnant, she can avoid it. If she waits those 3 months, she hasn't made the same baby healthier. She's ensured that a different, healthier baby is conceived instead of the one who would have had FAS. It highlights how timing and choice are already deeply embedded in reproduction.
So if this technology becomes cheap and reliable, the argument flips. The potential moral issue isn't using the tech. It might become not using readily available information that could prevent significant suffering for your future child. Refusing the knowledge becomes the weighty decision.
That could be the future dilemma, yeah. The burden shifts. If you can know and choose not to, Are you responsible for the preventable outcome?
A huge weight for parents. But all of this hinges on whether the information, the risk scores, are actually accurate and trustworthy. We hear there's a lot of variation out there.
Oh, massively.
Hmm.
This is maybe the most critical point for listeners right now. The quality ranges from, well, potentially validated science to stuff that might be no better than astrology.
Mhm.
You absolutely must ask tough questions. How did you create these polygenic scores? What data did you use? And crucially, how do you validate them? How do you prove they actually predict anything meaningful?
So what's the gold standard for validation, especially for picking embryos?
For embryo selection, the best validation comes from within family studies. This is key.
How does that work exactly?
It means the company needs to show their model can predict trait differences between adult siblings using only their DNA. Siblings share roughly 50% of their differing genes, but they grow up in the same parental environment usually. So if the genetic model can accurately predict, say, which adult sibling is taller or has a higher genetic risk score for diabetes based only on their DNA, then that model has shown it can pick up on the relevant genetic differences between potential siblings. That validates its use for embryos, which are just unrealized siblings.
Got it. So you test it on grown-up siblings first.
If a company can't show you robust within-family validation data, you should be extremely skeptical of their scores for embryo selection.
And even if a score is validated in one population, there's another big catch, right?
Yeah.
The ancestry issue.
Yes, the ancestry challenge.
Yeah.
This is a huge technical and ethical problem right now.
Yeah.
Most large-scale genetic studies, the ones used to build these polygenic scores, have been done overwhelmingly on people of European ancestry. The specific genetic markers and patterns the scores rely on, what scientists call linkage disequilibrium, are often specific to that population. When you take a score built on European data and try to apply it to someone with, say, African ancestry,
It doesn't work as well.
it often barely works at all. The underlying genetic patterns are different. The sources state that predictive accuracy can drop by as much as 80%. 80. So a score might seem useful for one family but be completely misleading or basically useless for another family from a different ancestral background. You absolutely have to ask companies about their validation and proven efficacy across diverse ancestry groups. It's an urgent equity issue.
That's a massive caveat. Okay, but on a more positive scientific note, you mentioned something called positive pleiotropy.
Yeah, this is actually quite encouraging. Pleiotropy is when one gene or a set of genes influences multiple different traits. You might worry that selecting against genes for, say, condition A might accidentally increase the risk for condition B.
The law of unintended consequences.
Right. But what the research increasingly shows is that most pleiotropy related to disease risk is actually positive, meaning the genetic variants that increase risk for one serious disorder, like severe depression, often also increase risk for other related disorders, like bipolar or schizophrenia. So selecting against high genetic risk for one often has the beneficial side effect of also reducing risk for others simultaneously. The risks tend to cluster negatively.
Okay, that offers some reassurance. If society did decide to regulate this, to draw some lines in the sand, what would those lines likely be? Where's the consensus, if any?
Well, based on current ethics discussions, the clearest lines seem to be around selecting against conditions that cause inevitable severe suffering with limited quality of life. Think Tay-Sachs, severe early onset neurodegenerative diseases, things universally seen as tragic. Then, more controversially perhaps, there's discussion around selecting against extreme antisocial traits, things like clinically defined psychopathy, sadism, extreme Machiavellianism.
Traits fundamentally harmful to others and social cohesion.
Exactly. Traits seen as undermining the basis for a functioning society. But that's obviously a much trickier area than severe medical conditions.
So let's try and wrap our heads around the big picture here. We've got this incredibly powerful genetic information becoming more accessible, more democratized, but it's colliding head-on with these deep-seated moral discomforts, especially around things like intelligence and these really knotty policy problems like inequality.
I think the biggest takeaway, looking maybe 5 or 10 years down the line, is the potential for growing geographic inequality, not just within countries, but between them. You see countries, particularly ones without the same kind of post-WWII historical baggage around genetics, sources mentioned Israel, China, possibly some Middle Eastern nations. They're talking openly about potentially subsidizing IVF and advanced genetic screening. They may see it as a strategic investment in national health, maybe even boosting birth rates or the population's overall genetic health.
Like a quiet, long-term genetic competition between nations.
It could look something like that. If some countries push ahead aggressively, embracing and funding this technology, while others, like maybe the US and parts of Europe, remain tangled in ethical debates or maintain bans and restrictions, that creates pressure. Eventually, the countries holding back might feel compelled to reconsider their stance just to avoid falling behind, whether that's medically, economically, or even perceived genetically.
Which brings us back to that final, challenging thought about individual choice. In a future where this tech is potentially common, maybe even subsidized, and proven effective for avoiding serious suffering, does choosing not to use it, maybe out of personal discomfort or fear of judgment, does that become the questionable moral choice?
That's the provocative question, isn't it? Does autonomy include the right to refuse knowledge that could prevent profound suffering in your child? When the genetic dice are laid out and you have the information to influence the role,
Yeah.
what does responsible parenthood look like then?
A lot to think about. Thank you for guiding us through this incredibly complex deep dive today.